Hey everyone, today we are going over the drafting instructions for our third paper, specifically how we can write a rhetorical analysis effectively. So our goals for paper 3 is really centered on writing rhetorical analysis of one of the two articles that we have read and we've been analyzing in class. Specifically, you're choosing between Wade and Faree's How to Do Gender and Solnit's The Longest War. So when you're writing a rhetorical analysis, it's really important to center it on one article that you're going to be analyzing so that you can give your readers a sense of how that writer is presenting his or her their argument, as well as really assessing the different elements of argument within it fully. And for our paper specifically, you guys are presenting and analyzing examples of how the author or authors utilize claims, evidence, and rhetorical strategies to persuade the audience. And you want to remember to remain objective and assess whether or not the authors effectively persuaded the audience, as well as really keeping in mind that you may not be the target audience. So really kind of brainstorming kind of how the target audience may react to the arguments being made. So for our rhetorical analysis, our thesis statement is very important because we really want to establish the argument that we're going to be analyzing, as well as the different elements of the argument that we're going to be talking about. Because remember, the thesis statement is guiding the readers. So we're introducing everything so the readers know what to expect and they can more easily follow the organization of our body paragraphs and how they relate to one another for our analysis. So for the purposes of our thesis statement, we need to include the article you are analyzing and the elements of the argument that you are analyzing. So you want to make sure that if you've chosen Wade and Faree, that they're included in that thesis statement, as well as if you've chosen Solnit, on the other hand, that you make it clear that the article is the subject of this paper. And you want to introduce that you're going to be focusing on two claims, two types of evidence, and two different rhetorical strategies, as well as the effectiveness for the audience. So it does seem like a lot of information. So the real thing that we really want to do when it comes to rhetorical analysis is just introduce these elements. We don't necessarily need to get into a lot of detail in our thesis statement. We just want to kind of use the terms so that the readers know that we're going to be presenting them in more detail later on. So looking at examples, I have 3 different examples of thesis statements for rhetorical analysis that I had students in a previous class write. So the first one reads, to effectively appeal to anti-maskers, Christoph uses claims, evidence, and rhetorical strategies like exemplification, authorities, and description. So if we notice in this specific thesis statement, I have introduced the effectiveness first, as well as who the audience is. So that is a good strategy, having that as an introductory phrase before we get into the real root of the sentence, which begins with Christoph, who is the subject of the sentence. So for this particular example, right, Christoph is the author of the argument that is being analyzed. And notice with this example, I say that he uses claims, evidence, and rhetorical strategies. So I'm not telling specifically which claims he's using that I'm going to be analyzing or the evidence that I'm going to be analyzing. So just by referencing them, I'm making it clear that I'm going to be talking about them. And then it gives me room to go into more detail and in my topic sentences without making my thesis statement overly wordy. Thinking of my second example, it reads, Christoph ineffectively appeals to anti-maskers due to his use of claims, evidence, and rhetorical strategies like description, process analysis, and classification. So if we think about this, it's presenting the exact same information. It's just rephrasing it. So now instead of beginning with an introductory phrase, Christoph is the subject of the very first word of the sentence. And then I have all of that information coming after. Similarly, I have the last example reading, Christoph created his argument using claims, evidence, and rhetorical strategies like exemplification, authorities, and description, which effectively appealed to readers. So the big change with this third one is I have that ending phrase, the which effectively appealed to readers. So this is additional information. So if we think about that, when you're introducing that you're going to be talking about effectiveness, you have a lot of options. You can introduce that first in the sentence, you can introduce that in the middle of the sentence, and you can also add it to the end of the sentence. So there are so many options in terms of how you can word your thesis statement, and these are just 3. Keep in mind that how you word your thesis statement for your rhetorical analysis could be different from these. These are just 3 examples to keep in mind. When it comes to organizing your introduction for your rhetorical analysis, we still maintain that upside down triangle format, primarily because it really sets up the proper context so your audience understands not just what it is you're going to be talking about, but the background about the article that is necessary for the elements that you're going to be analyzing. So of course we start with our hook. So this should always be the broadest part of your introduction. Typically in the hook, we never want to introduce the article. We never would start with our thesis statement. We want to be more broad. So as a general rule, like one rule of thumb that you could have is by introducing the general conversation that is going on that is leading up to the argument you're engaging in. So for this particular paper, you can introduce the issue of gender equality or gender inequality. So that is really just setting up the conversation, especially in terms of, well, why are the authors or is the author addressing this specific issue, or even what aspect of that broader conversation they're going to be addressing. Another way that you could do this for a specific rhetorical analysis is by introducing the different elements of argument and why they're important for persuasion. So in this case, you'd be setting up the context by addressing kind of, if we think about what is necessary for an argument, what do we need to assess, what needs to be there for the argument to be effective. And then when you introduce the specific article you're analyzing, right, you'd be using that article to illustrate those different points. So when you do introduce the article, you want to make sure to use the author or author's full names. This is really important to differentiate the author or authors from others who may have other works that may confuse the reader. You want to make sure to introduce the title of the article you're analyzing, and that should always be in quotations. And you want to introduce what that overall argument is. So you're giving your audience a sense of what it is the author or authors are trying to persuade readers to believe before we get into how the author or authors are doing that. The next thing we would introduce is the author's target audience. So this is important specifically for rhetorical analysis so that we're establishing that the choices the author or authors are making are made essentially to persuade this target audience. This is also going to help you once we get into your body paragraphs, because when you refer to the audience, it's already clear who that is, who it is you're assessing the effectiveness for. And the very last part of your introduction is the most narrow part, and that's the very last sentence, and that's where our thesis statement is going to be. It's really important to have your thesis statement be the very last sentence of your intro so that it's properly guiding readers into your body paragraphs. For organizing our body paragraphs, we really want to make sure that we have a body paragraph for each different element of the prompt you're addressing. So considering this assignment, you're supposed to be analyzing 2 different claims the author is making, 2 different types of evidence, and 2 different rhetorical strategies. As a whole, that means you should have 6 body paragraphs total. And when we add that to your introduction, your conclusion, this will be an 8-paragraph paper. So I've broken this into the different body paragraph organizations. So the first one would be a body paragraph that's analyzing a claim. So in this specific type of body paragraph, you always start with that topic sentence, and that's where you're going to be introducing the more specific claim that you're going to be analyzing. So remember, with our thesis statement, we were just introducing, we're going to be talking about claims. In your topic sentence, this is where you're going to be more specific. So I recommend always having the topic sentence connect back to that author. And one way that you can do that is by having the author's name as the subject and having claim or claims as the verb. So for example, you could have Solnit claims that, and then you could paraphrase the claim that you're going to be addressing. So that way, by using that structure, you're connecting back to your thesis statement explicitly. Next, you would present your textual example of how the claim is presented. That textual example is really important for your analysis, especially to show how the author is presenting that claim for the word choices that you're going to be discussing, as well as whether if that claim is explicitly or implicitly stated. It's really important to show how. And when you present that textual example, you want to make sure to integrate it. As a general rule, a quote should never be its own sentence. And you want to make sure to include your MLA in-text citation so that your reader can always find where that quote came from in that article, as well as in the book that you're using, especially if there may be different versions of the same article that may have different page numbers. After you present your textual example, you would end with your analysis. And when it comes to rhetorical analysis, we have two different parts of that analysis. The first part is when you're presenting the author's intention. So that really is breaking down how that author is presenting the claim, the choice that the author made in terms of the type of claim that's being used, why they've chosen that type of claim, or why they've chosen specific phrasing in presenting that claim, as well as analyzing why the author would have chosen to explicitly or implicitly present that claim, how that author was hoping that would benefit the argument that's being made. And the last part we would end with for our analysis of a claim would be the effect on the audience. So really how they're interpreting that claim, whether or not the author's choices were ineffective or effective. So we'd really explain why the author's choices would be effective or ineffective, how the audience would react or respond to the claim. If we think about a specific claim being ineffective, you could think about the phrasing issues that made it ineffective, or what was the author not really considering when they presented that claim that made it weak and therefore ineffective for the audience. For our evidence body paragraphs, we would of course start with our topic sentence, where we introduce the specific type of evidence that was used and that you will be analyzing. So for example, if you are analyzing Solnit's article, this could be a statement that Solnit uses precedent as evidence. So really, if we think about the evidence types, we were just establishing the different type that you are focusing on in this paragraph. You could use anecdotal evidence, you can use testimonial evidence, you can use exemplification, you can use precedent, you can use statistical evidence, and you can use studies. And we just really want to establish that before we introduce the textual example. So after the topic sentence, it's where we would introduce our textual example. And of course, similar to our claim paragraph, you want to make sure to present a quote to show not just what the author is using as evidence, but how it's presented. And of course, you want to integrate it and use proper MLA format. Using a quote for evidence instead of paraphrasing is also important because you can analyze the word choice in terms of that. You can analyze what's being emphasized in order to better address the effectiveness. When it comes to analyzing the evidence, you really start with the author's intention again. So that is really explaining kind of why does the author use this type of evidence? How does this evidence work to support the claim? And of course, why is this evidence relevant for the argument for the author to present it? And then we get into the effect on the audience. So for that effectiveness, we would explain why would that evidence be effective or ineffective for the audience? Would that evidence type be effective or ineffective for the audience? And of course, how would the audience react or respond to that evidence? Would it be enough for them to become invested with that point, for them to agree with the point being made? Or even if we think about getting into our appeals, would it start to appeal to them in a certain way? For our rhetorical strategies body paragraphs, remember you are having 2 paragraphs, which means that for the 2 different rhetorical strategies, right, they would ideally focus on 2 different appeals that you're focusing on. So unlike our second paper, you don't necessarily need to have a third strategy for the third appeal. We only need 2. And again, we would start with our topic sentence. So this is where we would introduce the specific type of rhetorical strategy that you'll be analyzing, as well as its primary appeal. So for example, we could have a statement that Solnit uses exemplification to appeal to logos. And then we can get into more detail in terms of where in the article does the author do that. So we would define that rhetorical strategy. We want to establish kind of how that rhetorical strategy works so that before we get into the specific example, our audience can start to understand it and then better make that connection when we present that specific example. We want to present our specific textual example integrated again, make sure we're using proper MLA in-text citations so that the audience can find where in the text that example is coming from. And then we get into our analysis. So for our analysis, we begin, of course, with our author's intention. So how did the author use this specific strategy? What specific wording was used? How is it working to build that specific appeal? And of course, depending on the rhetorical strategy you've chosen, there are more specific questions that you can address. And for those, you can refer to the Introduction to Rhetorical Strategies PowerPoint as well as reading that we previously covered. And then, of course, for this paragraph, we want to end with that effect on the audience. So is that rhetorical strategy effective or ineffectively used in terms of appealing to the audience and explaining why or why not? For our conclusion, we really want to follow that triangle format so that our conclusion really mirrors our introduction. If we think of this, we start narrow, so you restate our thesis. This signals to the readers that you are done with your analysis and you're bringing your paper to a close. It also establishes, if you think about it, all of the different elements that you've talked about so that it can really refresh the memory of your reader so that they can really think about all those body paragraphs and how they work together. And then we broaden the topic. So the biggest thing when we think about broadening the topic, we don't want to summarize what we've already talked about, because if we can summarize everything from our body paragraphs into our conclusion, then what was the point of having those body paragraphs, right? Summary also creates the issue of repetition, which we want to avoid, especially in that conclusion. So instead, when we're broadening the topic, we have options. So you can broaden that topic back to that overall conversation surrounding gender to really establish that this argument, these examples that you've analyzed are just part of that larger conversation. There are other arguments, there are other perspectives and other issues that have been or will be or should be addressed. Or you can talk about the importance of analyzing arguments. So why it is important to break down the elements of an argument to really see how they work together so that we can better understand and think critically when we're looking at arguments so that we're not incorrectly persuaded. Or you can end with why the construction of argument needs to be strategic. So really end by emphasizing the importance of strategy so that readers can really see that they need to think about how they're presenting things, why they're presenting things in order to be effective. Keep in mind while you're drafting that you do want to maintain objectivity. Remember, you may not be the target audience, so you need to assess and explain the choices the author is making to persuade the audience and whether or not the author was effective. Some strategies to do this is to maintain third person. So this really helps to distance you from the argument and means that you have to explain each point instead of presenting your opinion or thoughts about them. What happens when we use first person is we tend to make statements in terms of, I believe this is persuasive, which isn't enough for rhetorical analysis. We need to have this is persuasive for the intended audience because, and then really getting into that full explanation. And then we want to reinforce the author is the subject of your analysis. So a good way of doing this is by using the authors or author as the subject periodically of your sentences so that you're really reinforcing that what they're doing is what you're focusing on, that you're not presenting your own points. This is especially important in your thesis and your topic sentences, since those are the biggest guides for the organization for your readers. And this week we have our rough draft due. So our rough draft is due the end of the day this Thursday, so 11:59 p.m. So of course, if you have any questions or issues as you're working on the rough draft, just let me know. I'm available, of course, in my office hours or through email or messaging through Pronto. Our peer reviews are due the end of the day on Saturday, as well as our grammar worksheets, which cover apostrophes. And that is all that I have planned for today. Have a great one, and let me know if you have any issues.